Listen, I did film and television studies at university for 3 years. I spent hours reading countless books and articles on subjects spanning from film all the way to television. Not a single one mentioned Hugh Grant once.
I achieved the hardest qualification across any university or college ever, a 2-1 in history. Let me tell you, the only thing that I learned was that we, as a society, have a history of denying and neglecting Hugh Grant's artistic and cultural relevance, not just in this country, but in the entire world.
I met Oscar at a Hugh Grant-themed event I put on at the Students' Union.
It felt as though Diggory and I were the only ones there, and we agreed that there was a Hugh Grant-shaped hole in academia.
We decided to put it right ourselves. We want to show people that he's an icon in acting.
We want to show people he's more than just a bumbling posh guy.
I'm Diggory Waite.
And I'm Oscar Beardmore Gray. And this is...
Taking Hugh for Granted.
Hello and welcome to Taking Hugh for Granted, the podcast in which two Hugh Grant enthusiasts watch every single film starring Hugh Grant in the attempt to answer the simple question: is this film taking Hugh for granted? Is this film good on its own, or does it rely on the bumbling Brit for its acclaim? I'm Diggory Waite and I'm joined as always by my colleague and fellow Hugh Grant obsessive Oscar Beardmore Gray. Oscar, how the bloody hell are you doing today, mate?
Doing very well, Diggs, and even better to see you after a few weeks out.
Indeed. I mean, our listeners won't know this, but we say this every other week. It feels like it's like we haven't seen each other for ages, but listeners, we don't see you enough. It has to be said, because you are listening, and that's not how this works. We never see you. So, you know, send us some pictures of it. That sounds weird. I was going to say get in touch on Instagram and send us a picture of yourself, but don't. Did you see that we have had someone get in contact with us on Instagram? Did you see this? He said... Did you see this?
Saying that they look like Hugh Grant. I looked at it and didn't take it that seriously, but I saw that you had been replying.
Of course, I said, you know, 100% seriously. I said to this person, they said, my resemblance to the famous actor Hugh Grant. What do you think about our similarity? And he sent a picture of Hugh Grant and a few pictures of himself, and I simply said, you could be twins.
I feel like that is quite. That's quite vain. I'm not just going to say, I put it out there to compare yourself to the great man.
Hugh Grant. Bloody hell. This guy seriously thinks a lot about himself. And then he responded some hours later saying, hello, are you okay? Very kind. Can you send me an address from Hugh's main page or Twitter? Maybe he sees me and wants to use me in a movie. Or work with him as a substitute or whatever. Thank you for your help. And then he sent several more photos of him.
Is this guy serious? It sounds like he's serious. Like he thinks there's a doppelganger or something.
Yeah, exactly. It's loads of like profile shots.
So, like dad pics.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No smiling in any of the pictures on random nondescript beaches. Listen, mate, if you're out there, we love the pictures. Keep them coming. Unfortunately, if we had an in with Hugh Grant, don't you think we'd be using it already? Don't you think we'd be using that already? Talking
of ins with Hugh Grant, I've stepped up the game of chasing down his people. Last week, I phoned up that we've been in touch with Hugh Grant's agent. Look, publicist actually, who are in the States, and I just thought, why not? I'm just going to call them. So I called them and gave them our little pitch, said that we weren't weirdos who were complete losers. And she said, thank you very much for your call. That's really helped me. But I have yet to hear from them. So
yeah,
I don't know if that dream is dead, but if you're listening, Hugh Grant's publicists, we're still desperate to interview Hugh, and we'll do anything.
We'll do anything. We will do anything. When you said, listen, we're not weirdos, how did that... Did you hear a faint hesitation on her end of the line, or...?
Well, you know, I don't know. She genuinely seemed appreciative, even if she was probably completely like gobsmacked that this random person was calling her up.
Yeah.
But I do think that there is that slight, perhaps, kind of thing in people's head if they're like doing a kind of fan podcast that they might just be a bit weird.
Yeah.
And while we might be a bit weird, at least I feel like we have a little bit of a crumb of credibility, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I hope.
I remember I was working at my job at the moment, and it's at a TV company, and some of the when I was covering on reception, some people who ring up to try and talk to people about the show. One woman rang up demanding why there wasn't a DVD of a certain program, and then went on to recite a scene by memory to me, doing all the voices and stuff. And it was honestly, I was like, this is incredible. I was like, why do you need the DVD? You can recite it from memory, which is quite incredible. But there you are. I mean, if Hugh Grant's publicist wanted any indication of how strongly we feel about Hugh Grant, then she should really look no further than today, when we have watched. How long was this again?
3.5 hours, give or take.
God. Oh my God. 3.5 hours. Was this like, I don't think it was little episodes though, was it? It felt like it, but it was like maybe like 2 movies or something put together. I don't know.
It was 2 movies put together, but again, I say this every week now. Some hero has put this film Till We Meet Again on YouTube. And I sort of thought, okay, I saw part 1, part 2, and I was like, oh, okay, it's only an hour long. Maybe there's a part 3, hour and a half. I get to part 3, part 4, part 5. There's 7 parts.
There's 7 parts. Oh, my word. Well, let's dissect and divulge every single part after a synopsis from Synopsis Simon.
Till We Meet Again, based on the book of the same name, written by Judith Krantz, with the screenplay written by Andrew Peter Marin, directed by Charles Jarrett, and released over 2 parts in 1989. In the full swing of the First World War, in 1915, Eve, played by Lucy Gutteridge, meets Paul de Lancel, played by Michael York, while performing for the army, and falls in love with him. Devastated by Paul working in the army and his continued absence, his wife Laure, played by Susannah Harker, kills herself. After this, her family swear revenge on Paul by keeping his and Laure's son Bruno, played by Hugh Grant, and raising him to hate his father.
So Diggory, Till We Meet Again. This TV movie came out in 1989, and I guess the big headline, the big takeaway is that Hugh Grant stars alongside a pre-Friends Courteney Cox. And I mean, that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was really interesting to see Courteney Cox in this. I mean, I found it hard at first to sort of like get over the fact that it's Monica from Friends, but I think eventually when I did, I kind of bought into it a bit. What did you think?
I thought that she was actually really good, and I think actually she was the best actor in this film. To be quite honest with you, well, I think one thing that was interesting is that this film came out in 1989, and it's interesting that Hugh Grant and Courteney Cox both kind of got their big breaks in the same year, so they're like very, very much part of the same generation. Friends, the first episode of Friends came out in September 1994. 4 Weddings and a Funeral came out in May 1994. So 5 years later after this, so they could basically put down their success to this film. Someone's watched them in it together and thought, yeah, she'd make a great character in a sitcom, and he'd be a great bumbling guy in a rom-com.
Yeah. I mean, if you thought that about Hugh Grant in this film, if you somehow spotted him in this film and thought he'd make a great bumbling, funny person, I'd be like, hats off to you. Well done. You're a much better casting scout than I am.
That's true.
Let's talk Hugh Grant then, because it's Hugh Grant. What did you think about Hugh Grant in this film? Maybe talk a bit about his character, and then we'll talk about the rest.
I mean, where to start, Diggs? Hugh is perhaps plays one of his most evil characters in this film. He is a pretty despicable and despisable person. His name is Bruno, which I quite liked. Just imagining Hugh Grant as a Bruno made me laugh. He plays another sort of French dude, aristocratic French dude. And this film came out on the same year as Champagne Charlie. It's almost like a sort of spitting image of the 2 films, because he's like a sort of champagne lord who has a huge vineyard in somewhere in France. But he is a kind of like a Nazi sympathizer.
Not great.
He has a really horrible look halfway through the film. He gets this sort of evil moustache that we see in other films, and he sort of ends up kind of being exiled from his family, pissing everyone off that he knows, being really selfish, and he does some pretty nasty stuff, which I guess we should probably touch on.
We should touch on that. I mean, you're absolutely right. So there is a reason to all of this, and so the film sort of starts with, I guess, we'll call it the first two parts, the first hour, where it's back in the day, and two people fall in love, and one of them is Michael York, and he never spends any time at home with his actual wife, who has a baby called Bruno. She's so upset that he's never hanging out with her that she kills herself, and then her parents, I think, are right, we'll raise Bruno to hate his dad. And that's where this whole thing comes from. And that's why Bruno really in this film is just filled with hatred.
I think, Bruno, a hug might have been more appropriate.
Well, I hardly know you.
And whose fault is that? Every year I've begged you to visit us in the summer, but you never came. Foreign service has taken me all over the world, but you could have traveled to us.
Well, you know very well that I could not leave my Saint Fric or grandparents. Their health was always precarious. After all, they were my real parents. I had to think of them.
Hi. I'm Freddie, your half-sister.
Ah, yes.
You don't look anything like your pictures.
You couldn't have been more than 10 in those pictures.
And you're Delphine.
Will you be here this week?
I'm afraid not. No, I have to go into the cavalry to do my military service in 2 days.
Have you made up your mind about your plans after the military?
I shall read political science at university. It is my ambition to become Prime Minister and rid the government of lamentable fools.
What do you propose in their place?
A strong man. One strong man instead of a bunch of cretins. Like what Hitler has done in Germany.
Hitler? You approve of that unspeakable criminal?
He is a political genius. He has outlawed the communists and put the Jews in their place.
I think when he really goes bad is when, like you say, he grows the moustache on his face, which I feel like is becoming a bit of a trope in Hugh Grant films. Like, when Hugh Grant is bad Hugh Grant, he has a moustache.
You're absolutely spot on.
Yeah.
And I wonder if the casters of Bridget Jones were sort of thinking that we might put a moustache on him. But I guess pre-2000, the moustache was maybe a more acceptable kind of sexy thing to have on your face, whereas didn't quite fit the Bridget Jones type sort of model.
Oh, mate, imagine Daniel Cleaver with a moustache. That would not have worked. You would have been like, Bridget, get out of there. What are you doing? He's a weirdo. But it's true, yeah, because obviously, Clive Durham in Morris, when he turns his back on the gay life, so to speak, I guess he grows a moustache, which is sad. And there is another one as well, I guess. Is it Champagne?
In Champagne Charlie.
Yeah, I guess he's still a hero in that, but I don't know, that's a bit weird. But that's another thing that those two films are linked on. They both have this backdrop of war, and they both span over loads of years. And like you say, it's a whole Champagne thing. They have this, speaking of champagne, the family's fortune is in some champagne that they've kept hurried away in a vault. He not only fraternizes with the Nazis when they come along, he then lets them have he then takes all the champagne out and sells it all for himself. Absolute bastard. He then kills a farmer that tries to stop him, which is completely pointless. They hunt them down fine, and then he just takes this Nazi's gun and is like, bang. Then, and this is the thing that you were alluding to before, and this is the thing where he really is a bastard, and we can't really gloss over this. His half sister becomes a sort of famous actress, and he starts trying to ferry her around the Nazis to try and curry favor with them. When she's obviously what are you trying to do? These people are bastards. They have a scuffle. I don't know how to put this lightly.
He sexually assaults her.
Yes. And it's really horrible, and it's awful, and it's terrible. And then he turns up at his father's funeral at the end of the film and spits on the grave. I mean, he really is just the worst, genuinely. And I was sat there thinking, already before that scene, I was like, this guy is the worst Hugh Grant character ever. And then I was like, now he really is the worst in the world. In amongst all that, how do you think that he played it?
whenever your hero plays someone who's quite despicable, it's sort of hard to look at it objectively in some ways and take those two things as separate entities. I think he actually played it fairly well. I mean, what did you think? I think he was convincing as an evil person, like he often is.
Yeah, exactly. I think the thing with this film is that a lot of people, particularly in the first hour or so, it feels like a lot of people are sort of playing. They're kind of being kind of caricaturish. It's like it kind of almost feels like theatre. Like there's a lot of like large gestures and stuff. And I think what Hugh does quite well is he plays this role quite emotionless and it's quite reserved. And so actually what you were saying about Monica Geller, aka Courteney Cox before, in that she was one of the better actors in the film, I think that Hugh Grant is too, because he he's just understood the assignment, as the kids would say these days. You know, he is this despicable bastard who clearly doesn't have a heart. It's eroded away, and he plays the character the same way. He doesn't actually give too much emotion in what he's saying. You know, the closest you'll get is anger, and so he plays it quite straight and deadpan. And to be honest, I think that's good, and it does make you hate him. He is a bastard.
Yes, and one thing I'd like to add is that he doesn't attempt any kind of French accent, which makes it a lot better. Whoever was directing this film got the cool spot on, because he doesn't try some sort of English franglais accent, which sounds terrible. Even though it is, in some senses though, that actually is a little bit jarring, because I had to keep on reminding myself that all these sort of Americans and English people are actually French. And they're like, okay. And they always have, it's almost like they're always wearing dark navy blue and got like kind of France written across their shoulder to sort of remind you, yes, we are French actually.
Well, you're listening to Hugh Grant taking Hugh for granted on the radio. Hugh Grant taking Hugh for granted, the podcast show.
This is an interesting film because for the first like half an hour, 45 minutes, Courteney Cox isn't in it. And then when she does come in it, she suddenly becomes like the main star and she just completely steals the whole thing. And that makes me annoyed that it wasn't Hugh Grant playing her role. He would have made a great Freddy. He would have been brilliant. But yeah, what did you have any more thoughts on her? Because I definitely do, but do you have any more thoughts on her trajectory and her character?
Yeah, I thought her character was really well written. She plays a back against the wall kind of girl who won't get told what to do by her parents. She's set on becoming a war pilot, and she starts off by flying little dinghies with her first love of her life, which is a little bit weird because she's 20 and he's 43.
And that's not where their relationship began, which is much more weird. The first time she flies a plane, or like they go up together, she's like 12. And even in that scene when it's like the first time, her parents are obviously fuming and she walks off, and she was like, she runs back to him, is like, she's a 12, like she looks like 12 years old. She's like, oh, thanks so much, Mac. Like, and she's like, I'll be back. And he's like, I'm sure you will, kid. And even in that scene, you're like, is there something romantic going on here? And then, a few years later, they actually do get together, and you're like, this feels weird. This feels very weird.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that again is a bit of a constant throughout the film. Courteney Cox has, in this 3.5 hour mammoth movie, she has like 3 or 4 flings with different people. But going back to kind of her character, like I just liked how sort of badass she was, kind of, like she gets in the plane, she's doing loop-de-loops, she then joins the RAF, and she's like one of the only female pilots, and she, is a classic kind of like World War II vets are kind of like, we can't have women in the RAF, that's disgraceful, you're not going to stand a chance here. And she kind of like blows smoke in his face and tells him he's an idiot. And then she kind of becomes like kind of the star pilot. She seems to be a decent singer, although I'm not sure she's actually singing. She's very much mouthing.
Yeah, exactly. It's very awkward, those scenes.
But, she's just... she's just very charismatic. You can see why all these men fall at her feet. And but at the same time, she lives quite a sort of sad life in many ways, because she seems to be a little bit erratic at the same time, perhaps. I don't know if that's a bit harsh, but
yeah.
She kind of woos and seduces all these men who then she's not quite enough for them or something, or she steals the show and they feel like they're, not in the spotlight, and she overshadows them. And that results in sort of quite a lot of her relationships breaking down. And of course, her first relationship with that 43-year-old, the bloke literally just like dies in a ball of flames when his plane explodes.
Mac. He's gone, Freddie.
How can I live if Mac is dead? I can't.
I mean, one thing that struck me about this as well is that, like, most of the men in this film absolutely suck. Even Mac, who, like, is obviously really sweet stuff. Like, at the end of the day, it's fucking weird. And to be fair, he knows it's weird, and he's like, oh, I shouldn't do this, and that's why he refused to marry her. This is the 43-year-old, yeah, and he refuses to marry her and stuff because he's like, I am just too old for you. So I get it, but it's kind of like you're still doing it though. Like you say, it's a tale of woe for a lot of the film.
Look over there, Hugh Grant's in a Pret. Look over there, he's holding a baguette.
So Oscar, we're coming to the end of the episode, and towards the end of the film, we watch Hugh Grant meet his most timely demise. Let's be real, it really is. We've been waiting for it the whole film. What happened? Like, how does it start again?
Well, I mean, I guess it goes back to the funeral of his father. Hugh Grant and Courteney Cox's father, they're so they're half siblings. He suddenly dies of a heart attack, and that's a big deal because he is in charge and obviously owns all this sort of land and champagne, and he's very wealthy. And they have a funeral, and Hugh Grant comes out of nowhere and just spits on the coffin.
Unbelievable.
Which is just mental.
Yeah.
And then Courteney Cox slaps him, which he fully deserves.
Yeah, it was class.
And then the next scene is Hugh Grant explaining to the whole family that behind their backs, he has been working with his lawyers to get like full ownership of all the assets that his father owned. So he's basically like, look, guys, I'm really sorry, but I'm gonna own everything and you're gonna own nothing. So sorry, bye. Which is very selfish. And then, at this point, I guess the audience are like, fuck this guy. And he rides off into the distance on a horse, which, by the way, I feel like Hugh Grant's CV at the time must have been like, can do posh French guy, can do posh English guy, rides a horse.
Yeah,
so he's like riding a horse in virtually every film,
everything.
Is it?
Yeah.
And he rides off into the forest and then gets like apprehended by, I think it's the farmer who he kills his son.
Yeah, and his mates.
Yes, and it's a band of merry men, and they sort of they tie him against a tree and then literally like firing squad him.
Yeah, and shoot him to bits. I did find that ending, obviously, as great as it was to see Hugh Grant stopped, tied to a tree and shot. That was great. However, I was just a bit like, Hugh Grant has just told the family this horrible news, and he's like, right, now I'm just going to ride on a horse alone into the woods for no apparent reason. I wish there would have been some set up as to why he was doing that. I mean, obviously, one thing I did think was like, he's alone all the time in this film, Hugh Grant. Like, he doesn't have any mates.
He's a big loner.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, obviously, he schmoozes the Nazis a lot, but that's not really like any friendship or anything like that. As I say, he doesn't show any emotion, and the only one he ever does show is anger. So he rides alone, but I'm just sort of like, that clearly wasn't an easy way to get anywhere. So it's a bit like, is this a bit obvious that he just like is just riding alone, and then the townsfolk just set upon him and shoot him? I mean, it did feel great, but it was a bit like, a bit random.
Maybe it was a bit of a strange set piece.
Yeah, exactly. But then the police come along and they're like, well, it's clearly a hunting accident. So, and the other one's like, wait, what? He's like, yep, hunting accident. Right, we'll move along then. So,
but that's basically it. Hugh Grant is dead.
Yeah, which let's hope we never have to say that ever again on this podcast.
Because he bloody deserved it.
Taking he for granted. Taking he for granted. Taking he for granted. What did you think, lads? Were they taking he for granted?
Till We Meet Again, 1989. Are we taking Hugh for granted?
This is a tough one, isn't it? Because it is long, and Hugh Grant, and I did enjoy it. I don't know if I did, actually. I think I am going to say this film has been taking Hugh for granted. I think, understandably, I think it's too long. It didn't make me think as much as something like Champagne Charlie did. And it's difficult because I'm trying to get away from the fact that Hugh Grant was a bastard, but I don't think that a bastard like this without any redeeming qualities sometimes does make me... Maybe it will affect this as well, make me think it's worse. Also, Hugh Grant, I don't like his hair in it. It's too flat to his head. It's not floppy enough. At the end, it's quite floppy. There's like quite a hot scene, when he's tied up. I was like, okay, we've got the long floppy hair back. But apart from that, the thing is, he is good in it. I do think his performance is good and stuff. But I think ultimately, as good as Courteney Cox was, I think for me, this film has been taken for granted. I think if I hadn't been watching this as a Hugh Grant fan / for this podcast, I probably would have turned it off by then. So what do you think?
That's quite a good measuring stick, litmus test, isn't it? Like, if you weren't watching this for the podcast, would you turn it off? And the answer probably is yes.
Yeah.
But having said that, it's always fun watching these historical pieces where you have a big name in two big names at the beginning of their career. And I actually did think that Courteney Cox was actually really excellent. And there were a lot of people in the comments being like, I don't think Courteney Cox is a good actress, but she was great in this. And like, I love this film because of Courteney and Hugh, which is fair enough. But I am going to side with you, Diggs, and say this film is taking Hugh for granted. Like you say, I think you hit the nail on the head. Like, even though Hugh did play this role relatively well, I just think he was too despicable for me, and I think the film as a whole, with like kind of the narrative of like, there was just some weird like narratives about between like relationships with men and women and the sort of paedophile thing, and it just didn't quite sit right with me. No, and for that reason, I think I'm going to say it's taking Hugh for granted.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's an interesting point you make there as well, because I love all the relationshipy stuff. And again, it's so interesting to talk about this and compare it to Champagne Charlie. It's like there's lots of relationship stuff going on there. And yet I found that very thought-provoking in its own way. Whereas this, in a lot of senses, feels really quite one-dimensional. I mean, Hugh Grant's character can't be more one-dimensional. He just has pure hate in his heart, and that is the only thing driving him, and he just doesn't give a fuck about anything else.
You know when like two people get with each other in a film, and you're like, your immediate sort of reaction is like a recoil. It's like, what?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Rather than like, yes.
Yeah.
I feel like there were probably 5 moments where two people get together in the film, and all 5 of them, I was like, ugh.
Even to some extent, the last bit with Courteney Cox and that guy,
which was meant to be a sort of happy ending where she sort of finds her final love, but it was a bit weird. Like he didn't really like. There was no sign that she had fallen for him, or like that he was an appropriate partner for her.
No, exactly. I mean, obviously, the whole thing is she's like, I just want to be who I want to be, and he always lets her, which is really cute from that guy, but also, it just didn't feel like in that final scene that I was on board. Because she'd been so great, being like no, and he had been kind of weird. And so then when they finally did kiss, also, which it wasn't like your classic movie kiss where it's like he finishes saying what he's saying, she finishes saying what she's saying, and they look at each other and then they kiss. It's like he hasn't even finished speaking, and he's already grabbed her and trying to kiss her, and you're like, ugh. Anyway, side note, but I think that caps off what, unfortunately, is a film that's been taken for granted. And do you know what makes it so much worse is the fact that it took us 3.5 hours to find that out. This was a real slog, but we did it.
We did it, Diggs. Another one's in the can.
Another one's in the can. And more to be put into the can in the future. Make sure you are following us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. On Instagram and Facebook, we are at Taking Hugh for Granted. On Twitter, we are at Taking Hugh. Any final pieces of business?
Not really, Diggs. Just to say that we'll see you soon, and I'm just excited for more Hugh Grant content. As
always, and as per usual. Well, till we meet again, everyone. Goodbye.
Nice one. Bye.
Taking Hugh for Granted is produced, edited and presented by Diggory Waite and Oscar Beardmore Gray. The producers of Taking Hugh for Granted would like to state that this podcast is in no way associated with the actor Hugh John Mungo Grant, nor does it endorse his views or represent him in any way. Instead, by creating this podcast, Oscar and Diggory hope to celebrate Hugh's illustrious career, reliving his old classics and shedding light on some of his hidden gems. Hugh, if you're listening, we hope you approve.